Of all the mythological creatures throughout human history, I can make the argument that none are more iconic than the dragon. The often terrifying, occasionally wise, usually gigantic, frequently flying, sometimes living in dungeons for some reason, commonly fire breathing sky lizards are ingrained in pop culture to this day worldwide. Likely, if you asked any elementary school student on the earth if they knew what a dragon was, they probably do. Not all dragons are the same. Different cultures had different ideas of what a dragon was, and they represented different traits. Dragons have been a part of human mythology for thousands of years. A dragon statue in China was found that dates back to the 5th century BCE, and jade badges have been found from sometime between 4700 to 2900 BCE with coiled serpent creatures on them. These badges were believed to indicate rank. What is believed to be the first surviving reference to a dragon like creature in writing dates back to Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq, and is over 4,000 years old. It was found on a clay tablet written in Sumerian. The word Usum-gal appears on the tablet, which appears to be a compound word containing the roots Usum, meaning snake, and gal, meaning big. Now, this could have just been a reference to a larger than average snake and not a mythological creature, but the idea of this being a dragon like creature is backed up by other Sumerian works. It was likely a mythical creature inspired by both snakes and lions. Now, I'm going to pull a quote directly from a source here, so I will go ahead and cite the source, as well as link it in the description. J. Chrysostomo, a professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Michigan, is quoted as stating, "It is one of several mythical creatures that combined various animals and typically conveyed traits related to wisdom, power, and protection. The Usum-gal is especially noted for its mouth, so presumably it had a large, gaping maw." And those are two themes that tend to repeat themselves throughout the mythos of dragons: nobility and wisdom, and terrifying proportions and powers. Dragons appear in the cultural record from cultures spanning the globe. Asia, Europe, the Middle East, Africa, Polynesia, and the Americas all have different but similar versions of them. These versions have many differences, but are similar enough to definitely fit into the same category. As already stated, dragons appeared in the cultural record of the Chinese several thousand years ago. Dragons were typically revered in Chinese culture, often being depicted as either aquatic creatures or as living in the clouds. They were often associated with rain, lightning, and thunder. They were generally portrayed as benevolent creatures, rather than monsters to be feared and or slain as in other cultures. They were often associated with royalty, in hopes that the rulers would strive to show the wisdom and benevolence the dragons personified. There are even legends of dragons directly aiding rulers, such as Yu the Great, circa 2700 BCE, where a dragon and a turtle were said to have aided the emperor in reining in floodwaters and building irrigation systems. It was even suggested in the legends that Yu the Great himself may have been a dragon. Unlike their Chinese counterparts, however, European dragons were seen as malevolent, destructive creatures. They were often thought to be living in caves and guarding hoards of treasure. They were also said to abduct and eat livestock and or people who got too near their lairs. European dragons likely originated in ancient Greece, whose depictions of dragons may have evolved out of early Middle Eastern legends about the creatures. Similar legends about dragons extend all the way from the modern-day British Isles to as far away as India. Most of the legends follow a common theme: a hero with a mission to slay the foul beast. Dragons were used as allegories for anything from sin to the devil himself in Christian countries, to greed, hence the sleeping on piles of treasure, to a cause for diseases and other maladies that often festered in European bogs. Europe is where the modern legend of fire-breathing or poison-breathing dragons originated. There was even one European legend where a hero slew a particularly foul dragon, only to die after touching the beast's toxic blood. And heroes didn't always defeat their enemies in European dragon legends, just as real threats often persist in real life. Middle Eastern dragons seem to have some aspects of both Chinese and European dragons. They could represent monsters or wise beings. The Middle Eastern dragon may have unintentionally served as some kind of ideological bridge between the dragons of Europe and Asia as well. People tend to tailor their legends to their own environment, and Mesopotamia is largely a desert. It's not difficult to imagine Mesopotamian people hearing these legends from Asia of beasts bringing rainwater to the fields and thinking, "We don't have some great beast delivering us rainwater. Clearly these dragons are selfish dicks." That could then lend itself to the idea of the dragon being viewed as more selfish and greedy. Since this would be happening on top of the idea of them being wise, the pathway to a dragon as a cunning foe could have had its seeds planted here. Now, I couldn't find any direct evidence of this in my research, so let me state that the last couple of paragraphs are purely speculation on my part, but it seems feasible to me. Africa also has its own legends of dragons. Most are centered around Egypt, though a few are scattered around the rest of the continent. African dragons were either viewed as world-creating deities or as disruptive and destructive creatures. One legend of a dragon tells of a creature demanding sacrifices from a village. Polynesian cultures had multiple versions of their own dragons. Theirs were often either directly deities or at least beings with supernatural powers. The idea of dragons being shapeshifters is prominent in many Polynesian legends. Hawaiian depictions of dragons have them as capable of transforming into geckos or people. They petrified when they died and became part of the landscape, according to legend. Like Chinese dragons, these creatures could control weather and water. They often lived in caves, fish ponds, or natural pools. Other islands had differing depictions of dragons. Maori depictions were very similar to those of Europeans, whereas on the Solomon Islands, the creatures were depicted as nurturing half-human, half-dragon creatures. Polynesian dragons sometimes personified fertility, death, or both. Mesoamerican culture also had its own version of dragons. The feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl is one example. Like some Polynesian depictions, Quetzalcoatl represented both birth and death. Quetzalcoatl was a deity and shared legends, though not names, among many Mesoamerican cultures, such as the Olmec, Maya, and Aztec. So, Chinese, Middle Eastern, Egyptian, and even European dragons could have shared a common lineage along trade routes, even in ancient times. Polynesia and the modern-day Americas would have been far more disconnected. It's possible oral traditions of dragons could extend far further back into prehistory, and that all dragon legends could share a common lineage. It's also possible the ideas developed independently, somewhat of a convergent evolution, but for an ideology. So now that we've established that dragons appear in the cultural history of multiple groups of people around the world, it begs the obvious question, why? Why specifically giant flying lizard monsters? I mean, it's not like dragons actually exist, so it could have been any kind of giant flying monster, right? It could have been flying elephant monsters that shoot lasers out of their trunks, or giant spider monsters that suck the souls out of their victims, or giant flying spaghetti monsters, or whatever. So, why specifically giant flying lizard monsters? Well, I have some thoughts on that, but before I get to articulating my guess, I need to rewind the clock a bit. If you'll indulge me, let me take us back to the time before the Age of Dragons, or people, or mammals as a dominant species on the planet. It's 10:16 p.m. on October 7th, 66,003,237 BCE, give or take a few 100,000 years. The dominant species on the Earth aren't mammalian, they're reptilian. More specifically, they're dinosaurs. And they're doing dinosaur things. Eating, sleeping, sunning themselves probably. I'm assuming singing along with and dancing to Was Not Was's Walk the Dinosaur. I have no evidence to back that last claim up, I'm just gonna assume that's what they were doing. Mammals exist at the time, but they're primarily small, burrowing creatures that stay out of the way of the dinosaurs. That's because if they get in the dinosaurs' way, the dinosaurs will eat them. Now, the true giant predators of the era probably wouldn't have been the ones preying on the mammals. I can't imagine a T-Rex trying to eat creatures the size of mice. Proportionally, that would be less of a snack than me, a slightly larger than average human, eating exactly one piece of popcorn chicken. The dinosaurs that would have eaten mammals would be much smaller, like the Microraptor. And while those types of dinosaurs wouldn't be large by modern human standards, they'd have stood like giants over the mammals of their day. Those mammals would develop an innate fear of giant lizard creatures. It would be a survival tactic. And the winners of the game of natural selection would pass that innate fear down to subsequent generations. So for mammals of that era, an instinctive fear of giant lizard creatures is now buried somewhere deep in their genetic makeup. Natural selection was reinforcing that fear, or at least not discouraging it. And those mammals had children, who had children, who had children, ... skipping a few dozen million years, who had children who became us. Then, of course, a giant space rock came and hard rebooted the Earth, thus wiping out the dinosaurs. And unfortunately, was Walk the Dinosaur wouldn't get radio airplay again for another 66 million years. Now those mammals who survived the Chicxulub impact and still have that innate fear buried in their genetic code no longer have giant lizard monsters to worry about. They are able to spread out and diversify into the mammals we see today. That naturally selected instinctive fear of giant lizard monsters continue to get passed down, even in the absence of an enormous reptilian threat. Because here's the thing about evolution. It doesn't ever get rid of anything. It just builds on top of existing structures. That's why we, as modern humans, basically have modified fish eyes, modified horse spines, occasional vestigial tails, and knees so easily injured that news monsters find that information useful. Now, modern humans may be on our way to losing some pieces, such as wisdom teeth and the appendix. Even if wisdom teeth and the appendix stop manifesting in future humans, the genetic code will still be there. It will be more a case of it being commented out of the active code rather than deleted from the code repository. And it may still manifest in a small number of future humans. Thousands of years from now, children might be born with vestigial appendices, similar to how some children are born with vestigial tails today. Modern humans' body structure is basically the equivalent of if someone built a house 1,000 years ago, and someone built a stables on top of that, then a bank on top of that, then a Chinese restaurant on top of that, then a gymnasium on top of that, then an auditorium on top of that, and then a skyscraper on top of that. You might wind up with a functional skyscraper, but you're going to have a lot of parts of the structure left behind you don't really need, and at best aren't particularly useful, and at worst make the structure overall slightly less stable. Survival instincts, to me, function in the same way. Our ancient mammalian ancestors developed the innate fear of giant lizard monsters because at the time, giant lizard monsters were trying to eat them. That fear got naturally selected and passed down to future generations by those mammals that didn't get eaten, and evolution built on top of that, adding to it rather than removing it, even though there were no more giant lizard monsters. The closest modern equivalent to a dinosaur that we have is possibly the Komodo dragon, which is large and certainly capable of handing a human a death certificate, but not gigantic relative to us, at least not to the standard that dinosaurs would have been to our mammalian ancestors. And here's where we take another side trip, this time into human psychology. Human brains are really good at a few things. It turns out we're excellent at pattern recognition. We were able to predict seasons and navigate by the stars before we, as a species, even knew what the stars were. Given enough time, we're really good at using our environment and bending it to our will. This is how ancient peoples with Stone Age tools and no understanding of modern math or construction techniques were able to build things like the Great Pyramids. Another thing we're really good at is projecting our innate subconscious fears. The universe is a cruel, unforgiving place, and the overwhelming majority of it is fatally hostile towards organic life. There are significant unknowns out there, and even events that are known, that if they happened to us, we would have absolutely no defense against. For example, something like a gamma ray burst, also known as a GRB. If one were targeted at us, and in close enough range, it would result in the end of all Terran-based meat popsicles, and there'd be nothing we could do about it. Granted, most people don't actively worry about getting fried by natural death rays. There are enough terrestrial threats to keep our minds occupied. But death from above does represent a potential pervasive subconscious fear. We, as organic biological beings with a shelf life, are generally pre-programmed to want to live. We instinctively fear things that make us not live, particularly when those things are entirely beyond our control. Survival instinct is extremely powerful and triggers reactions to threats, even if it's only on a subconscious level. And this is something we see in a lot of modern fiction with the trope of evil aliens. They're hostile toward the protagonist beings on a planet and can often do severe harm. They can sometimes even do planet-killing levels of damage, such as the Death Star in Star Wars. It takes something loosely like a gamma ray burst, which we have no hope of stopping, and assigns a similar feat of destruction to an alien or race of aliens that our heroes can defeat, generally within a 90 to 180 minute runtime. It takes one of our subconscious fears, and in our squishy human meat brains, gives us a plausible way to defeat it. Or at least, a plausible way to feel like we can defeat it. Now, I'm not saying the writers of Star Wars deliberately designed the Death Star's planet-killing laser to emulate a GRB, or that they even thought of a GRB at any point during the writing process. But being able to stop a beam of planet-eliminating size destruction makes us feel slightly better, even if it's in no way applicable to the real deal. And that brings us back to our flying lizard monsters. We've already discussed how that buried genetic code leaves us somewhat biologically pre-programmed to fear giant lizard monsters on a subconscious scale. There are several other things our prehistoric mammalian ancestors would have developed inherent fears of, such as flying creatures. Modern raptors like hawks and owls will still hand out game overs to small rodents with impunity to this day, and our ancient ancestors would have been similar in size to some of those rodents. Without modern tools like guns, even modern humans are typically not good at air defense. And I think this is why phobias of flying insects are such a common thing. It's not that the insects are a threat, mostly. It's that the dormant evolutionary code for fear of flying predators still gets unburied and triggered in some people. Genetics is always a lottery, and we still don't have a good sense of what will manifest and in whom. Another thing we as a species have an ancient subconscious fear of: uncontrolled fire. Until the discovery of the campfire, fire was this entirely destructive unknown force. It burned without restraint, and the only thing that could stop it was running out of fuel. Ancient mammals couldn't comprehend this, and they knew it hurt them, so they would run from it. And that fear is also buried in our collective psyche. And for those of you saying, I'm around fire all the time and I don't fear it, I offer the following. You're probably around controlled fire. Campfires, forges, steel mills, all of those are controlled situations. Let a fire alarm go off and see how the average person reacts, even in those settings. I mean, you might not panic, but the initial sound will definitely grab your attention. So we have these innate subconscious fears of flying creatures, fire, and giant lizard monsters. And what is a dragon often depicted as? That's right, a flying, fire-breathing, giant lizard monster. It's an amalgamation of several of the buried evolutionary fears that mammals develop survival instincts against. It's like the Death Star, but encapsulates some of the terrestrial threats that I mentioned earlier. And for ancient peoples who didn't understand things like weather or electricity, those amalgamations of our fears became the symbols for things we couldn't understand. The sky is rumbling, and arcs of light that catch things on fire come down from the sky with no apparent rhyme or reason. Those arcs of light catch things on fire, so they must be fire. There must be some monster in the sky that breathes fire. Flying lizard monsters in the sky that breathe fire. It actually kind of makes sense if you know nothing of the science of nature, which we as a species didn't until the past few hundred years. And that leads us into another thing that human minds do well that's pertinent to the dragon discussion. We tend to take those projections of our innate fears and turn them into symbols. These symbols are either used as a focus for or tool to provide empowerment against said fears. You see symbology in action in this way commonly to this day with sports team names. Lions, tigers, bears, panthers, jaguars, wildcats, raptors, grizzlies, and so on. All of these animals are capable of hastening us finding out whether or not there's an afterlife, and we slap them on helmets and jerseys and sell them to people who just want some guy to hold on to the damn ball. In this manner, they become a symbol for something we feel like we have some control over: sports. They aren't a threat to end us, just to disappoint us or cost us money if you're into sports betting. It takes the power away from those animals in our minds, even though a real predatory cat or bear would still own us harder than a linebacker in the 1970s hitting a guy on a hospital pass. And of course, not all sports teams have symbols like that. I don't know of anyone that fears socks of any color. And animal references of these types are not driven by direct fear. Most symbols aren't. Things that are direct fears we deal with or run from using a fight or flight response. Things that are subconscious fears, or fears that we can't face directly, we symbolize. This is the same reason that fear-mongering as a political tool, as despicable as the tactic is so effective. People have fears about things they can't directly solve or face, so they look for a symbol. Politicians are happy to provide that symbol, be that anything from taxes to immigration to religious extremism, either too much or not enough, depending on who you're asking. And people buy into that idea or group of people as a symbol for everything they feel is wrong. That way, they can feel they're dealing with the situation by dealing with the symbol. The same thought process also applies to things that aren't real in any way, like dragons. Dragons are often portrayed as evil and destructive, as creatures to be slain by heroes. Dragons gave people subconscious fears a focus. The dragon is truly mighty, but it can be beaten. If it can be beaten, it gives people a sense of power over it. On a behind the scenes level, it gives people a sense of power over the fear that symbol represents. Of course, the symbology is not always used to represent evil. Sometimes we manifest the things we fear into positive symbols. Chinese culture never feared dragons, they revered them. They represented wisdom, royalty, and life-giving reign. They took something they had a hard-coded inherent fear of and made it into a symbol that benefited them, thus giving them a way to assuage those fears. So the next time you have to roll a saving throw against a dragon's breath weapon, just keep in mind that it may not be coincidence. It may actually be a natural process of our evolution as a species that the dragon in question is trying to turn your character sheet into scrap paper. Oh, and don't roll a natural one. I have it on good authority your character is crunchy and good with ketchup. And that does it for this video. As always, if you enjoyed the video, feel free to like, subscribe, comment on, or share the video. And thanks for watching.